This is Fantology.
You may have heard of us.
All right, what's up, fantasy book fans? This is Steven, your host from Fantology, with my lifelong friend Ben, and a special guest today. We have once again an author. We have Richard Swan, author of Justice of Kinks, which is coming out next week. Although by the time this episode releases, may just be like a day or two away from release. February 22nd, I believe, is that right? That's the release date.
That is correct in the US, yeah.
Okay, so we're billing this as kind of like an anticipation for the release. Like you should go out and buy the books, and obviously we're not going to do any spoilers. Ben has read the book. I have not actually, so I definitely don't want to hear spoilers because I plan on reading eventually. But we just kind of want to.
You're flying blind.
Yeah, exactly. We want to hear about the book, Richard, and try to get people interested. So maybe to start, just kind of give us like a blurb, give us something to get excited about. Why should we read?
Of course. I think the way I kind of have been thinking about it recently is, do you remember that bit in The Revenge of the Sith when Mace Windu has Chancellor Palpatine at the end of his lightsaber, and he says he's too dangerous to be left alive, and he's about to kill him, and Anakin obviously stops him from doing that. And if you kind of think about that as a thought experiment, what Mace Windu was effectively about to murder Chancellor Palpatine, legally it would have been an extrajudicial killing. There was no due process. He would have just literally hacked into pieces with a lightsaber. But of course, and so, in theory, that is unethical. I mean, unethical is the wrong thing to do, right? It's murder. But, in reality, of course, it absolutely would have been the right thing to do from a kind of broader ethical perspective, and depending on where you kind of sit on the kind of moral spectrum. But of course, I think, few people would argue, I mean, Chancellor Palpatine was evil, right? I mean, he was literally evil in a very kind of literal sense. And many tens of thousands of people, we presume, died as a result of his actions. And so if you look at the kind of the moral spectrum, although, as I say, killing him would have been legally impermissible, I think it would have been ultimately the right thing to do. And if you kind of think about that and drill down, I won't drill down into it, but if you think about it and why it would have been right or wrong, I think that at the core of that question, which I've already vexed, is at the Justice of Kings, which is ultimately, if you have a sort of a legal system which is a secular, a fairly liberal, fairly rigorous, system of common law, which kind of applies to everybody, which in the book it does, which is kind of one of its great strengths in the Soviet Empire, is that no matter who you are, you're subject to this law. What happens if it produces, essentially the wrong outcome, or arguably the wrong outcome? And so it's a kind of exploration of that legal and ethical grey area, really, but in a sort of secondary fantasy world. So when I was kind of pitching it to my agent, I kind of said, well, he's if you take a bit of Robert Harris's Cicero trilogy and you kind of throw in a bit of C.J. Sansom's Shardlake, but then a bit of, Geralt of Rivia, his kind of magical powers, and a kind of Judge Dredd, sort of medieval Judge Dredd kind of, and you kind of melt all those things together. And that's kind of how I pitched it to him. And that pitch made its way through to the publishers who obviously bought it. So that's where I am with it at the moment. Yeah.
That's awesome. I think one of my favorite parts of the book was it like almost teaches you about like morality and like about legal ethics, and then it causes you to question everything it just taught you. So I thought it was super fascinated by that.
Absolutely, and I a lot of that is it's kind of entry level stuff. I mean, I'm not a philosopher, but it's the kind of, when I was at university, and I obviously did a law degree. I'm a litigator, that's my job. And one of the modules of that law degree was jurisprudence, which is the theory and the philosophy of law. And it's kind of like, there's just two big schools of thought, which is sort of consequentialism, which is the kind of, you focus on the ethical consequences of an action. And there's deontologism, which is the action in and of itself. And so the deontologists would say, well, the killing of Chancellor Palpatine is murder. Murder is unlawful killing, and that is wrong. It's impermissible ethically. The consequentialists would say, yes, but that is one death of an intrinsically evil man, taken against a backdrop of the many tens of thousands of innocent people, genuinely innocent people who kind of stand to die if he isn't, removed out of the equation. And it's something I've noticed a lot in media over the last 10, 20 years or so as I've been growing up. There's a great reluctance amongst like Hollywood studios, for example, to have the heroes be anything other than moral absolutists. So what you will notice when you watch a movie is, for example, Captain America is a great example. He won't kill anybody unless it's in some kind of self-defense. And you just watch it and you think, goodness me, just kill Thanos, just like airstrike him or something. I mean, just sniper him, laser him from orbit. It is obviously legally and ethically correct to do that, it's the same with Chancellor Palpatine. Gollum, isn't it? Just Gollum is planning to murder you, Sam and Frodo. Just kill him. It's fine. And I think we get a lot of the time these villains, they end up kind of dying from kind of they've overreached, and they end up killing themselves, or it's almost like a form of moral cowardice on the part of the filmmakers. And I'm not just saying just like kill everybody and solve all your problems. That's right. And as a lawyer, we are very careful to not make absolute value judgments and things like that. And due process is extremely important.
Anyway, okay, so we were just talking about like kind of all these moral and ethical questions. Yes. It must have been like with your deep well of like knowledge from the law, it must be hard to kind of condense that and make it super accessible in a book, right? Like it's almost like explain it to me like I'm 5, but like in a fantasy book.
Yeah, exactly that. And I think, there's always a danger of overdoing it. And I think we hit a nice, during the editorial process and the book that you've read and the first draft are not a million miles apart. So we kind of hit a nice balance with it, I think. And I wanted to make sure that as a theme, it was kind of fully explored, because I felt like I had, allegory and it was a nice thing to explore. But at the same time, you have a fantasy audience and they're going to want some action and kind of a bit more, a bit more than just like a lecture on moral philosophy. So I kind of had to work it in a way that was hopefully a bit nuanced and a bit subtle. And so I think there's only one time in which sort of Ron Ball actually sits down and kind of tutors Helena. And that was probably enough. And then the rest of the kind of the moral quandaries I kind of explore in the warp and the weft of the narrative. And the other thing I snuck in as well is an explanation of marine insurance, which I'm especially.
I was like, okay, all right.
I was like, is this a novel about marine fantasy insurance? I think it might be underwriting. So but again, in a way that when I like every writer, I kind of write what I want to read, and I think I'm not I don't really go in much for the kind of the huge battle scenes, the action scenes. I think they certainly have their place in writing, but that's a very visual medium, and it's difficult, I think, unless you're a very skilled writer, to kind of make that really engaging. And I'm more of the kind of reader. I really prefer the kind of the long conversations and the dialogue and the kind of the intrigue and that sort of thing. So I read the conversation about the marine insurance, medieval marine insurance, and I actually was, so I actually really like this as a piece of writing. I was quite happy with it, but it hasn't. I haven't seen it in any reviews, so I don't know how well it's doing at the kind of the meta of the review sphere. But yeah, you're absolutely right. It's a balance, and hopefully I struck it.
Yeah, well, I also enjoyed it. I particularly enjoyed it because I think like 99% of people are going to have a pretty intrinsic understanding of how insurance works.
Exactly.
And so it's interesting to see like, oh, we know how this works. Like, let's see how like these like medieval people are going to like process all that,
And exactly right. And I think that's one of the great benefits of fantasy as a vehicle for exploring themes. And I've only just kind of got to the stage. I've been writing for years and years, and obviously for most of that time it's been a hobby. But I've only just kind of, as I've kind of hit my early 30s, I've only just really started to get sort of comfortable with using allegory and exploring kind of modern day themes in writing. But I think when you look at the fantasy world, and the fantasy world is a kind of technologically and sociologically nowhere near as developed, obviously, as our kind of if we're taking the sort of the medieval analog, which we are in this instance, although albeit a kind of quite late medieval, you can use that as a vehicle to really highlight modern day issues, like a kind of a patriarchal society, or law and justice, or in this case,
Sure.
fantasy marine insurance. But in quite exactly as you've just said, in quite kind of like in quite stark terms. So as you say, as a reader, that what they are talking about is insurance, but for them, it's this brand new, fascinating, brand new concept. Wow, it's money for nothing, and you can do that. You can say, well, for goodness sake, it sounds like it's just gambling money or nothing at all. I'm just lining your pockets, kind of thing. And a lot of more jaded people would say that now, and so you can highlight the absurdity of certain things through the kind of that historical lens, and that's why I really like fantasy as a medium.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. So I don't want to give any spoilers for the book, but one thing I really enjoyed about it was how it was a complete story, but it also left like a ton of things open for the future, right? Like, I don't know if you read Mistborn. It kind of felt like the end of the first Mistborn book in that respect. Like, there's an ending, but it's really just like a prologue to like what else is going to be happening. So that was a cool balance. How did you like go about trying to like think through that?
I think whenever you write a series of books, and this this just comes with kind of practice and experience writing, but to my mind, and I'm sure to every other writer's mind, when you have a book that is not the only book, you have to have two things, right? You have to have a book that is self-contained reading experience, so that I hate cliffhangers, right? I think they are, as a device, they have their place, and like I use them a lot internally in terms of the end of chapters and things, and I think they're a kind of great hook to keep readers kind of turning the pages, and use of foreshadowing and things like that, but at the very end of it. So one of my favorite ever books, which is Hyperion by Dan Simmons.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Which was just a tremendous book. I thought it was an absolutely brilliant book. But it ends on a cliffhanger, a really unsatisfying cliffhanger as well. They literally just almost nothing is resolved. And I was like, that sucks. This was like a 10-star book for me, and now it's like it's still amazing. So to my mind, I think if you're writing a book in a series, you have to have a payoff. So you've got two storylines. You've got the internal storyline, and then you've got the meta storyline. Yeah. And so to sort of use Lord of the Rings as an example, the Fellowship of the Ring. But then in the first, I'll use the movies because it's slightly different, out of sync with the books. But into the first movie, the Fellowship is broken. So the Fellowship aspect is done. That storyline is now finished. Sam and Frodo are approaching Mordor to continue the meta storyline. Yeah. But you could stop watching Fellowship of the Ring and be like, that was a fucking great movie, which it is. Yeah. And so you've got enough, and you leave a few threads to sort of keep going. And so the real difficulty, I think, is hitting that balance with book two. There's nothing new in that. I think a lot of writers struggle with this. And I am keen. I've finished book two. I've handed it into my editor, and I'm going to get edits back on that in the next couple of weeks. But I was keen again to have another mystery running through it. I like having every story has a mystery in it, which is resolved. So the reader is like, great, I feel satisfied as a reader, but you still got the overarching trilogy thread. So we advance the trilogy in Proctor 3, but each story has its own kind of payoff as well. Yeah. And that's just a matter of kind of structure and planning it in that way. Hopefully, as you say, I'm not great at finishing series. I read a lot of first books in series, and then I won't read any more. That's my kind of hobby vice, and so for me, it's important that first book, and loads of people will read The Justice of Kings and they won't read the rest of the trilogy. I know that for a fact. That's what I would do. So, and so it was important to me to close it off. Like, you can read The Justice of Kings and think that was a great story. I'm probably not going to read the rest of it, but I enjoyed that one. Yeah. I'd love you to read the rest of the trilogy, but you don't have to. And so that was something that was very much the forefront of my mind as I kind of approached the structure of it.
Yeah.
I'm back, Richard. I apologize. Depending on how we edit this, it may or may not be obvious that I was out for a bit with bad internet, and now it's
quite all right. You were always a little bit. I was saying to Ben, you were a little bit blurry for me, but now you're back to being crystal clear again. So fingers crossed, it stays that way.
Indeed, yeah. They're putting in fiber by my house, and I think
okay.
I think I'm struggling today.
Put a spade through a cable.
Yeah, very well could have. What did I miss? Sounds like you're talking about writing a one contained story versus a trilogy.
That's right, and we just explored Ben told me that he was going to be a lawyer himself one day, so we were talking a little bit about the kind of the legal ethics, exploring kind of modern concepts, but in a fantasy setting where the reader kind of knows what you are driving at, but you're kind of doing it in a kind of very rudimentary way. So using that as kind of a device, because I said to Ben, there's a section where they're explaining marine insurance, but in a kind of fantasy legal setting, which sounds incredibly boring, but it isn't, I hope.
It drew me in. I was like, oh, and it connects to the overall plot too.
Exactly.
So it was good. One thing I was interested in asking about, like, reading it, there's like all these small things that you did to kind of immerse the reader in the world. For example, some words just had like different spellings. Like, I remember like connection was spelled like CON and EXION. Right.
Yeah.
And so how did you go? Because I don't think I've ever seen that before. Like, how did was that just like, I mean, did you draw that from anywhere? Was that like your own brainchild?
That's a connection with an X is an old English spelling of that. So you'll still see that in legal circles in England. It's kind of dying a bit of a death now, but magical with a K, for example, is another one I suspect you're thinking of. And
sure.
And I think if you ever read any Black Library fiction, which is obviously the publishing arm of Warhammer 40,000, and I've read a few books of Dan Abnett's, and which are very, very good. I like Dan Abnett a lot as a writer. And he was very kind of instrumental in kind of forming what the Warhammer 40,000 universe looked like in fiction back in like the early 90s or mid 90s. And I remember listening to an interview with him where he was like, I don't want to say, radio, because when I hear, and if you're not familiar with it, this is like a military science fiction kind of setting, but it's kind of very gothic, very dark, very bleak, sort of almost quasi horror setting as well. And he was like, well, I don't want these guys, shooting like a demon, kind of from the warp, and you're blowing it up with like lasers and things. I don't want them to say, I'm going to get on the radio, because then it sounds like they're like this, they're a SEAL team, or like, and we want to kind of move away from that kind of aesthetic. So, and I think certain words like magical, but with like a C, that makes me think of like a magician. That doesn't make me think of like sorcery. So I wanted them to kind of refer to this arcana, these kind of magics in a way that kind of felt like an archaic usage of the term. So connection is just an archaic spelling. Magical with a K is another archaic spelling. I just wherever I could, I used either foreign loan words like Kloster, which is the German for cloister, which obviously I used in terms of the monastery. I didn't want to use monastery because I thought, again, monastery makes you think of, it puts you in mind of a very specific thing, and I wanted to kind of move away from that into a more like a secondary world setting. And so it's just a way of kind of slightly breaking your mind's link from modern concepts. It's as simple as that.
No, well, it's super effective. Like I said, it was like had a very immersing effect.
Great.
I'm interested. Like, is there going to be an audiobook? And if so, like, how would you like go about like telling the narrator, like, hey, let's pronounce this way? I don't know.
There is an audiobook. Yeah, no, there's an audiobook. They did. They got Lucy Paterson, who's we agreed early on that it had to obviously be a woman reading it, because it's a woman writing the book, and so Lucy Paterson sort of did that. And I didn't have much. The only thing I really had to do with the audiobook was choosing a narrator. So I got a choice of 3, and I chose her. So it was more kind of trying to get the right sort of timbre of her voice. And then I produced a pronunciation guide, which actually was surprisingly difficult. I think there's a lot of, the book is kind of like a kind of Teutonic, sort of Slavic setting, like a Holy Roman Empire, kind of Baltic states setting. And so in terms of the analog, the sort of real world analog that I ended up using. And so it's about, but a lot of people will say, if you think of like the car brand Audi, some people will say Audi, which is not actually the correct pronunciation. It's Audi. And so a lot of the time it was about getting that ow sound, the AU, the ow. So Lord Souter, for example, Lord Bauer, it was, and a lot of people will naturally say that anyway, but we got through a sample of one kind of audio book reading, and a lot of the pronunciation was just a little slightly off. I was like, okay, I'm going to have to kind of write this down. So that was my only real input into the audio book, but I think I've only had a sample. I've my Audible credit I've used to buy my own audiobook. So I'm not paying for it, but I'll use my free credit. I'm sure the rest of it's great. I'm really looking forward to listening to it actually and seeing kind of what she does with the voices and whether she, modifies, does different voices for different characters and things like that. That was very exciting to listen to for sure.
Oh yeah, so it sounds like your publisher is kind of handling a lot of that side of things. What was the journey like to kind of get started? Because this is your first published book. Am I correct in it? Yeah.
It is. Yeah, it's my first traditionally published book. Yeah.
So there must have been. I mean, I know this is not an easy thing to get to.
No. Far from it. Fantastic is the short answer. I've been writing for many, many years. Like a lot of writers, I started kind of like in my early teens, and I just kind of one day decided it was something I was going to do, and it just became a thing that I did. It was just a hobby, and I ended up writing, a lot. I mean, I've written about 20 or so books worth of fiction, and most of those just kind of sitting on my hard drive. I mean, they're a lot of them are rubbish, but when it got to about 2015 or something, I kind of was like, what is this KDP? People are kind of self-publishing now, and it seems like we're no longer in the realm of vanity press. You actually can, the tools are available to kind of self-publish and in quite an effective way. And so, I was a lawyer. I was getting paid like a fairly decent, salary. So I was like, I've got a bit of disposable income. I'm going to pay for a, proofreader because they're quite expensive, and I'm going to pay for I didn't pay for an editor, but I paid for a, the cover art and everything. And I kind of, I created this, it was a science fiction trilogy I ended up doing, and I'm still, pretty happy with that trilogy. And I sort of self-published that. But of course, with self-publication, there's like an immediacy to it. So, you're working entirely under your own steam. So, when I finished a book, I'm like, great, let's chuck it up on Kindle. It's done, and that can happen in a matter of days, really. And you're kind of really holding the reins on all of that. So I stepped away from my first experience of self-publishing was quite good, actually. I got fairly decent traction with that science fiction trilogy. And then about 2 novels later, I had a much more typical self-publishing experience, which was that just literally nothing happened. Like I self-published a novel and it got like 0 readers and like maybe like sub 10 downloads or something. And I was like, you know what? That was a lot of effort for very, very little payoff. And that didn't used to be what it was about, but now I have tasted the forbidden fruit of having a readership. I want more. And so I thought, okay, let's. And being traditionally published had always been, of course, the goal. And self-publishing is great, but I think there is a kind of third-party validation when it comes to traditional publication, where a group of people have said, yes, this is a good book, pat on the back, well done, like we can make some money out of it. And so whereas anybody can self-publish, me included. So there's some great stuff on there, like I think Senlin Ascends started life as a self-published novel, which is one of the best books I've ever read.
We sat down with Josiah a few months ago, and awesome. An
amazing book, like amazing. Nothing else like it I've ever read. And I remember just being consumed by it. I thought this is, and it had that, I know it's not what we're talking about, but it had this very kind of uncanny feel to it. Like, you're reading and you're like, I have no sense of place in this world. Like he didn't describe any of which I thought was a great strength. He didn't describe any of the surrounding countries or the nation or anything, and it just had this kind of really unsettling feel to it that kind of made you feel like it was quite a dangerous. It's a brilliant book anyway. But he self-published that, right, and that was a runaway success. So you can get some excellent books, you could get loads of rubbish as well, and you do. And so those are the pitfalls of self-publishing, right, and very little to distinguish you from thousands of other people. So traditional publishing was always something I wanted to achieve from when I was, very young. And so, sorry, to answer your original question, I got an agent. So basically I thought, right, well, it seems like the roadmap is you get an agent these days. So I wrote The Justice of Kings. it was just another book I had written. Like the previous 19. There was nothing in. I liked it a lot. I thought, I think this one's got some legs. I think this can go the distance in terms of publication. So I was tempted just to self-publish it. I very nearly did. And a friend of mine, I asked him, and I said, George, what do you think? And he said, well, tell you what, look, self-publishing will always be there. Like, you'll be able to do that whenever you want. Why don't you give the traditional publishing game a go first? And so I submitted it to about 3 agents. One I never heard, well, maybe 2 I never heard back from. No, one I never heard back from. One said no. And then the third one, who's Harry, I was like, yeah, send me the whole thing. I really like it. And so from there, we went through like an edge. He did some editorial comments as well. He was like, I think it needs to have a bit more action in it. I think the ending needs to be a bit more explosive. And there was that whole action. I went some time to do it in a non-spoiler way. That whole scene at the end, Ben, which you obviously know with the fighting, did not exist in the initial. That's all new. So it was very much more of a kind of a fantasy courtroom drama.
Oh, I could imagine that.
Yeah. So the trial was kind of like the end of the book. And it was a bit more like, you can handle the truth kind of, thing. And that was the payoff. And then he was like, I think we need to kind of have a bit more fighting here. And he was absolutely right. And it is a much better book for it. And so we did that. And then he was like, I'm going to send it off. I sent it to the Big Five. I'm going to send it to Orbit, Galanx, Tor, Door, the other one. So he did. And then he was like, look, they might all say no. Don't be disheartened. We'll just write another book. A lot. This happens a lot of the time.
Just write another book. I love.
Just write another book. Yeah, sure. Yeah, no worries. I've got a couple more. And so anyway, Orbit came back really quickly and said, "What's going on? Have you spoken to anybody else about this?" And Harry was like, "Yes." And they, have you lost? I look like I've frozen on your screen. Have you still got me?
We got the audio. But
you got the audio. That's the important thing.
Yeah.
Frozen in like quite an awkward place. It looks like, basically they preempted it. So James, who's now my editor, was like, "We love it. Like, basically, give us a number in terms of the advance." So they ended up, paying a very large sum of money for it, which is very kind of them. And they bought it that way. But I found the whole reason I talked about the self-publishing aspect of it was, the traditional publishing aspect has been very slow. And my agent said at the very beginning, it's like, look, there's going to be, this is a very exciting time. We bought the book, we got a great deal. It's fantastic. It's all going to go quiet again, and nothing will happen for like a good few weeks. And you need to be prepared for that. You need to be prepared for like the odd spike of excitement and engagement, but then like weeks of nothing, like complete radio silence. Because ultimately, as the author, the only thing I'm really responsible for is the writing of the novel, and practically everything else is taken care of by Orbit. And of course, they consult with me about different things, like what does Von Vault look like, for the cover art, and what does the map look like, and things like that. But ultimately, they have the final creative say on how the book looks and how it's produced. And so it was, and this was back in September 2020. So it's been a long road. Yeah
No kidding.
Yeah, they have publishing windows, so they like to release books at a certain time of year, and they couldn't, it was too late to hit the publishing window for kind of fantasy in 2021, so they kind of pushed it to 22, and they wanted to add like about 30,000 words to it, which is almost exactly what we did add to it, and things like that. So the traditional publishing process has been very eye-opening, and just kind of how slow it was, and how kind of low intensity it was. And so I've just had to get, in those early months, as you can probably imagine, I was kind of refreshing my emails like every 5 minutes, and just super excited about it. And then of course now I've just made my peace with the fact that it works at its own pace, and that's just not in line with my own, wants and desires, and it's probably never going to not be that way. So yeah, that was a difficult thing to get used to, for sure.
Yeah, from what I've seen following other authors along and their social medias and such, it seems like about a year before the book is published, they're like talking about how they've just submitted their final draft, and then like a year later it actually comes out.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I'm actually quite far it. As I said, my book 2 is written, and I don't know how much that will be edited, but probably a lot more than book one was, because I had a bit more time to write book one. But I'm kind of 30,000 words into the first draft of book three now, and
wow.
book one hasn't even come out yet. So I'm so far ahead of the curve that it's, the other day I was like, I've got a bit of time to kind of explore other projects, and can I get an early steer on this idea that I had? And I just sort of pitched it to my agent, and he was like, yeah, sounds great. Let me ask James. And he's my editor at Orbit. And James was like, look, I'm sure it's great, but we are so far ahead here. I can't even begin to kind of give you any guidance. It's, we have no idea how well Justice of Kings is going to do. Obviously we hope it's successful, but it might not be. And, all the rest of it. So I would hate to, or we might want you to write more books, with these characters, or in the Empire of the Wolf, or we might want you to not do that, or so, it's just way too early. So at the moment, I'm just kind of poking around on other ideas, but there's really not much else for me to do except kind of finish the trilogy and see how that performs, so commercially. So
that does bode well for readers of the books, because one thing people always are hesitant on getting into a new series is like, it's book one. Who knows when the author's going to finish the entire trilogy? But if we can tell them like, hey, we're making Rich is making great progress on.
For sure.
Book three at this point. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah. No, I mean, the whole trilogy will be finished this year. I'm certain of that. Like, as I say, I'm very far ahead of it. But yeah, people have a weird. I'm not a huge fantasy reader. I haven't been like, I read way more sci-fi than I do fantasy, and so I haven't really been part of the. I've read plenty of fantasy over the years, but I haven't really been part of the fantasy kind of microcosm or discourse over the last 3, 4, 5 years. And so now that I am, I'm very late to the party, and I'm just finding out people are obsessed with this idea, like consumed by this idea that the author might not finish a series. I was like, apart from like one example, or like maybe two, it's a Pat Rothfuss and then like George Martin.
We're all thinking those two.
It's like, is there anybody else not done it? Like, I feel like I'm taking crazy pills. It's it's, and so much is. And you see all the authors will come out the woodwork and say, look, if you don't buy our books, so that we can't write more books. This is a business model that relies on people buying the first book and getting that churn. And so if you wait, which is absolutely correct, by the way, like that is literally how the business works. So if the Justice of Kings performed really badly, that would probably be it for my like writing career. Like that I'm contractually, they have to publish the second two, but that's it. Like, and then that would be, so it is slightly frustrating to see this kind of
like a chicken before the egg type thing. Like
exactly. So it becomes self-fulfilling after a while if people kind of hold out for the whole series. Sorry, you go on.
I was gonna say, as a fan, I think the most important thing is like the communication aspect, right? It's like, hey, if you're like, I want to wait till for like a finished, polished product, you know what I mean? Like take however long you want. Just like communicate that, you know what I mean?
Definitely.
So,
and a blog is like, it's a good way of doing that, isn't it? I mean, it's just a record of your program is as dry as it can be to read. Sometimes if people are looking for that comfort, then there it is.
Sometimes people literally just need like one Reddit post saying like, hey, I'm writing, just so you know.
Yeah, still alive. Still doing it.
And from experience, like there are authors like Scott Lynch is another one that has a super successful series out there that is yet unfinished, but he's communicating like, I'm struggling with these aspects, I'm just like, fine, I will wait. I will happily wait.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean?
Well, that's it. Yeah. And you want the final product to be the best possible. I mean, I saw Andrea Stewart pushed the Bone Shard Emperor, I think it's the third one, back by 6 months or something, and she just tweeted about it, and everyone was like, yeah, great, cool, thanks for letting us know, type thing. That's what that's all it takes. But
it doesn't sound like we're gonna get that from you, Richard. It sounds like you're like you're gonna I'll
be done. I mean, for all I've just spoken about how long it can be, it can also be like tremendously short. I mean, I've seen people being like, I just turned in my first draft of book one over like 6 months before publication. So they obviously can turn on the taps when they need to. But as I say, there'll be no, unless I die, which I suppose is always a possibility. The trilogy will be very much finished in the next kind of 6 months or so, I think.
So you talked about some radio silence along a long process to getting published in the first place. Now we're a week away at time of recording, and by the time this comes out, it'll probably be right around the time that the book is released. So what are the feelings now? Like, anxiety, excitement, or how's it going?
I think it's certainly an odd feeling because, as a writer, I'm not going into like an office or anything where I'm surrounded by the writers and, as fun as that would be. Yeah. So I'm not going to like the Orbit office where I sit at my desk and write the novels, which is probably the future of writing. But and so, ultimately on the day of publication, I will still get up in the morning and just have like a day in my apartment. And so I'm preparing myself for a kind of strange anticlimax. But what I am going to do is I'm going to go into town and pick up a hard copy, obviously, and then tell the cashier that I wrote it. No, they wouldn't care, but I'm going to do that anyway. And obviously have the obligatory photo of myself with it. I've got there's another writer out here in Sydney called Jeremy Sall who is a science fiction writer. He's got a couple of books out at the moment, so I'm going to go grab some beers with him on the 23rd and just have a bit of a celebration, and obviously some champagne with my wife. But yeah, I think it'll be weird. I think the thing I've got used to seeing like reviews, like, kind of professional, sort of semi-professional reviewers, who've all got their kind of advanced copies of seeing their reviews. And I always think that the reviewers who get like advanced copies generally tend to be a bit more kind of, what's the right word? Well, professional, I suppose, is the right word, in terms of they give the book a fair shake. They're kind of at pains to kind of, not say, oh, this was a piece of shit and I hated it. And they kind of approach it with a kind of a sort of
they don't want to burn bridges, that's for sure.
No, exactly. Yeah. There's a vested interest in them kind of doing good work on the review. And even if they didn't, I don't mind if people say, well, of course I don't mind any review really, but if someone says, yeah, you know what, like, I can see why this book is makes a lot of people happy, but it wasn't for me, or I didn't really like the writing style or something or whatever. That's absolutely fine. I think what I'm slightly nervous, and I try not to read too many reviews, especially on a day where I'm writing, because I think if you read a bad one, it kind of torpedoes your writing efforts for that day. But I think what I'm slightly anxious of is like what is hopefully a wave of like layman reviews, like, the general reading public, where
like the Goodreads comment section area.
Yeah, exactly. Where people, and it's an odd relationship, because I obviously speak to reviewers on Twitter and whatever, and I get tagged in reviews, and I only get tagged in nice reviews, obviously. But and so there's a weird kind of, parasocial aspect to our relationship. And so I was talking to Alan, actually, who you may know of a Library of Alexandria, and I'm having a chat with him tomorrow, actually. And he was a kind of very kind of early and enthusiastic adopter of the Justice of Kings, and he's been very nice about it. And I was saying to him on Twitter, I was like, but what happens if you don't like book 2? We obviously have like a nice, very friendly relationship now, but would there not be a slight awkward? Would you? Because I would hate for him to feel compelled to say nice things about the second book. Like, that's the last thing I would want. I wouldn't want people to feel like they have to say nice things. But would you not feel slightly compelled, like if you'd built up a relationship with someone, to a little bit of pressure to maybe either say something nice or nothing at all?
Hearing you talk about this is so fun, because it's like the exact type of moral quandary that like I just can tell you love writing about. Absolutely. You just like get in these like situations like, oh man, what would happen here?
Yeah, no, but exactly. But it's an odd kind of. These are all explorations of the kind of these human dynamics, and I think there is a risk that you get people who feel compelled to say things that they don't necessarily believe in. But I think it's the unguarded reviews of the people who don't know me from Adam, who will say, oh, this book is a piece of shit and I hate the author, I think he's a dick. That. And so you learn, obviously you learn nothing from it. But I've been guilty of that as well. Me as a reader, I read, I said before, I love Peter Hamilton. I think he's a fantastic writer. He's a British science fiction writer who I don't think either of you know, but he's tremendously popular. And he wrote a book called Great North Road. And I thought Great North Road, it's a well-written book. Peter Hamilton is a good writer. I'm sure he'll be thrilled to hear me say that. Who the fuck is this? But he's a good, but I didn't like the book, and I thought this book is way too long. This is like 400 pages too long. Like there's not enough happening to sustain this kind of word count. I was kind of brutal about it in my review, and so I think it's extremely easy to be negative in reviews.
Oh yeah, everyone's a cynic these days.
Of course, and even a book that you like, or even an objectively okay book, it's still easy to kind of pick up on a few things and say, I hated this bit, or it really fucked me off, and so I think it's that kind of unguarded review that and I've got a fairly thick skin. You can't be a litigator and not have one, but I think once you have spent a year or something, writing something and kind of crafting it, and it's gone through that. And of course, you've had dozens of people say, "Oh, this is an amazing book." My editor, my agent, everyone's like, "That's a fantastic book," and all the early reviewers think, "What an amazing book!" And then, of course, you kind of start to think, "Oh, maybe this book really is the next big thing." And then, of course, then you see NetGalley or something, and someone is like, "God, this was the worst piece of shit I've ever read." And it's like, whoa, and it really kind of brings you back down to earth, which obviously is important.
Yeah, I doubt there's too many early reviews like that. Like, imagine if you were the one who read Game of Thrones back when it was published and posted a blog about how terrible it was. Like, your review career is not going very far.
And an objectively good book by any standard. No, of course, but you will see reviews of great classics of literature where people are like, "Oh, this is really boring," and just fucking rubbish book, and it's off, A Tale of Two Cities or something. It's one of these great pillars of English literature that people just kind of give a 1 star to, and so it's So I think I think that's the thing I'm and of course at the moment I'm writing full time. I'm taking a break from the law since we moved out to Sydney last October. I'm kind of just concentrating on this. It's something that I've always wanted to be a full-time writer, so financially we're in a position where I can do that. But there's always that worry, isn't there? Well, this is not, it may not be a particularly sustainable, I've never had my career so in my hands and the hands of other people. Like, if the book is well received, it'll be a success and people will buy it and I'll be able to write more books. But if it isn't, that's kind of the end of it. And obviously, as an employed salaried lawyer, that was bar putting a foot completely wrong and fucking up a case or something, that was never really a risk. I always had people I was accountable to, partners and the senior associates and things, and that isn't the case here. The buck stops here, and so that's the kind of confronting thing as well. So I think it feels a lot, the stakes feel a lot higher, I think, in a way that my previous writing and novels and self-published stuff didn't. I would get a negative review on my self-published book and I would literally laugh, because I think, what a fantastic review, it's pretty accurate, these books are a bit shit, and that's kind of funny. But now I get a negative review and I think, shit, is that one less person who's going to buy the book? Is it going to be slightly less successful as a result of that review? And the power sometimes that these reviewers have is quite kind of elemental. And so I think there's as much as I love being where I am now, there's this slight anxiety that comes with that as well. Being kind of thrust into the limelight in such a profound way.
Well, just so you know, from our perspective, there's a lot of hype around this book, from our little niche reviewer community. So
very niche community.
Yeah, very niche.
Oh, well, that's very pleasing to hear. Fingers crossed it translates into the wider reading public.
I will say,
but you're right. If a reviewer like a Daniel Green on YouTube reviews something and says, it was all right, it wasn't super great, I'm sure that's devastating.
Well, it must be, right? If you've got, especially if you've got a huge platform, because a lot of people will be, I've seen comments where people have been like, I probably won't pick this one up then, if you didn't like, and it's like, no, just shaking the screen, don't listen to him.
I will say, I want to get this in. I don't want to forget about it, because you've earned a badge in my book, because there's a first, so never in my life have I had this happen to me, but I was very sick one day while I was reading your book. And the book actually, so I had thrown up earlier in the day, But one of the scenes in the book actually prompted another throw up.
No way.
And that was never like, I've read some pretty like dark stuff. And just for like people out there, the book has some violent parts of it, but the majority of the book is not violent. Like you're not like getting into Joel Abercrombie, right? So
that's right.
But there was, it was a battle scene, and there's this thing that happened, and I just like, I threw up.
Oh, go on. So you've got to tell me which one bit it is now.
Well, it was somebody had his head split open.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So it was I don't know, something. I was just picturing that scene so vividly, and it
yes.
Yeah, so that was I've never had that happen. I hopefully will never have it happen since. So.
I'm so pleased you said that, because I wrote, much probably like you guys, I grew up 9/11 happened when I was about 12, I think, and the global war on terror, kind of dominated all the headlines, my teens and early 20s, and everything that came with it, and the internet being the Wild West it was back then, there was a lot of live leak and kind of videos of guys getting blown up by tanks and things. And my dad was a fighter pilot, so he spent some time in the Middle East as well. So I was very in that world, and it was a huge influence on me in my writing, especially kind of my sci-fi self-published stuff. But that's another theme that I've carried through into this book, which is that kind of
like realism.
What does a society that sort of expounds these kind of liberal, Western values, if I can call them that, human rights and all the rest of it. What does it do when it kind of runs up against an enemy that has no respect for those values and will do kind of atrocious things, and so what do you end up with? You end up with things like Guantanamo Bay and all that kind of stuff, which is a whole different conversation. But I think and that was again something I'm always interested in exploring, and that's a very Ian Banks. If you're familiar with the Culture series, that's something that he does with his kind of Special Circumstances division, which he explores this kind of ultra liberal utopia, but they have this kind of branch which is dedicated to kind of performing the kind of operations that they very publicly shun and distance themselves from.
Yeah.
And so it's a very roundabout way of saying this, but so I've seen a lot of like horrible stuff on the internet, like genuinely gory, real life gory things, which no one should have to look at by any stretch. And so I was like, I was trying to, when I was writing the book, I was trying to bring that kind of visceral, gore, because also if you think about like a medieval battle, right, it's absolutely horrible. And if you ever listen to have you heard of what's his name, the guy who does his Hardcore History, Dan Carlin, does a Hardcore History podcast? Sure. So he does a great series on the Achaemenid Persian Empire and the kind of Hellenistic wars, and he talks for a podcast basically about an ancient battle. So a battle between some Greek heavy infantry and some kind of Persians, and what form that would actually take. And he looked at kind of historical sources and kind of contemporary sources, and it was something like, if these sword cuts, they're cutting into the flesh and they're severing kind of all these arteries and things, and because of the way the wounds work, you're actually spilling vast quantities of blood, and it's something like he worked out that basically every corpse is leaking a couple of liters of blood, say, and if you have 10,000 casualties, that's however many thousands of gallons of blood. And you would have and there were contemporary sources of like battlefields with the topsoil just absolutely saturated to a depth of a couple of feet with blood. Jeez. And so and these just horrific battlefield injury, spear through the brain and brains.
So 300 is pretty accurate then. With
exactly, absolutely historically accurate, 300. And so I was trying to sort of bring that kind of level of realism. I was thinking, and I remember reading about one of the I think it was the Battle of Tadworth, which was one of the last medieval battles in England. It was during the Wars of the Roses, which is obviously what George Martin writes a lot about in his Game of Thrones books. And there was one particular instance in that where they had guys, they found skulls with their molars having cracked because they were so terrified before the battle that they were clenching their jaws, so they were cracking their jaws. And Dan Carlin said something similar in the Greek, in the Macedonian phalanx. They would have guys just literally shitting down their legs. They would have, diarrhea kind of trickling down their legs. They would, of course, as you would be, right? It's a terrifying experience. Yeah. And so I wanted to kind of capture some of that viscerality with the battle scene, and then just really make it quite horrible and graphic. But having said all of that, what I thought was quite graphic. And then the feedback has been, there's some violence in this book, but it's fairly tame, or it's fairly standard. I was like, what? Well, What are you guys reading?
I think that it's that way because it is contained to certain parts of the book. But I mean, like, it's not like you have to worry about something crazy happening every page. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
So that's
I was like, what? Because I do read a massive amount of contemporary fantasy fiction. I'm changing that now, especially because a lot of my contemporaries now are saying very nice things about my book. But I still haven't read like really violent.
Yeah, you should read Joe. Have you read Joe Abercrombie? Yeah, have you read him?
I started. What was it? First Law or something?
Yeah, First Law.
Yeah. Yeah. A long time ago, but I don't know. I'm Joe Abercrombie is a phenomenal writer. He has legions of fans, so I don't think he'll mind me saying this. But it didn't really like draw me in as much. And so I kind of put it to one side. But that was years ago, so I'll give him another go. Yeah. But he's obviously massively popular in the fantasy community.
I think honestly, like your description of like battle and stuff reminded me a lot of his work. So I mean, that's a big compliment to you.
That's a huge compliment. Yeah, thank you very much.
And so but it was like that visceralness. But with his, it's like more like it could happen next page. Like a
at any time there could be
like you could be walking through a street and get your head bashed in.
And it's not just war; it's torture and all kinds of other like domestic violence. Like anything's on the table.
Okay. Because I wanted to, with the book, and I've done this a little bit in book 2 as well, because there's another battle in book 2. You're gonna have the obligatory battle. That's my Helm's Deep is book 2. Yeah.
Okay.
Nice.
It's not the Siege of Minas Tirith, but it's there is a Helm's Deep in there, and I think there's what I want to capture in each book is that kind of. Well, one thing I'll never do is sexual violence. I don't think there's enough of that.
That's a good call.
There's enough of that in the real world without having to kind of delve into that. But as a rule of thumb, I'll never do that, and I have no plans of ever doing it. But actual violence, fine, and I sort of I like to be kind of an egalitarian with my violence in terms of like men and women. So if you have women soldiers, and men soldiers, then it's fair game. Everybody's going to get messed up, right? And so there is a kind of there are a few scenes in book 2 where there's kind of, again, what I want to do is like have one shocking moment. So I think one thing George Martin does exceptionally well, I mean, there's a lot of things exceptionally well, but one of the things he does well, and they capture this really well on the TV series as well, is he's very good at having like these one standout like blockbuster shocker moments that everyone is talking about, like the Red Wedding, for example. And one of the ones for me was the bit where is it Oberyn Martell? I can't remember. He gets his head smashed in.
Yeah, the Viper, the Red Viper.
The Red Viper. He gets his head like literally crushed.
Yeah,
I remember watching that on the TV. I read all of the books, but I remember watching the TV series, and I turned the TV off afterwards. I was like, fuck. I just sat there for ages. I was like watching Pedro Pascal's like lifeless corpse, just like lying there, and it really stayed with me for a really long time. Another one was what you initially think is the burning and tarring of the Stark boys by
Theon
Greyjoy, and the decapitation of Roderick Cassel. Sorry, massive spoilers there. But everybody's read it, so it's okay. And again, like it just sat with me for ages. And the music is playing this horrible kind of demented music, and he's kind of hacking the head off, Roderick Castle.
Yeah, because he can't get it through the first time, and
exactly, And it's just this horrible, brutal scene. And again, it just lingers with you afterwards. And so I wanted and there's the bit in that I won't spoil it, but it's the bit with Justice August. Ben, you'll know that bit. I'm talking about. That's the kind of, I wanted people to kind of see that and be shocked by it and be like, fuck, that's actually pretty horrible if you really think about it. And so there's another scene like that in and amongst all the kind of the battlefield gore and things. There's another scene like that in book 2 where I just want people to kind of, not in a gratuitous way, but I just want it to be like a talking point where people are like, oh, do you remember that bit when this happened and it was really fucking gross. And so I think every book, like should have one of those. And so that's kind of what I'm shooting for with the gore. But I think, as with anything, less is more. And I think if you saturate a novel with, people getting their heads smashed apart, then it becomes a bit old hat.
Yeah, I agree. I can see that.
Well, we've kept you for a while. Should we end?
Absolutely.
End
Sorry
on the graphic violent note?
Yeah, of course. I did warn you. I talked a lot. So
no, this is great. Is there anything like how can fans reach you? How do they like interact with you?
Absolutely, yeah. I do have a Twitter account. I think that's definitely the best place to do it. I like to be fairly active on Twitter, but I have a website as well, and that's got my blog on and a few other bits and pieces as well. So, but that again, the link to my website is on Twitter, so I have an Instagram page too, but I have a separate family Instagram account, which I was like, well, that's my that's thing for my friends and family, so I'll create an awful one. But then I realized I've got nothing to upload to this. Like, there's so many pictures I have that are related to my work as a writer, so that's pretty slow. But yeah, definitely Twitter is I'm on there every day, and it's a horrible website that monopolizes way too much of my attention, but there we go.
Awesome.
Yeah. And then with the Justice of Kings coming out next week, is there any specific way that fans can support you, or like anything that you would say, like if you're going to buy the book, buy it from this location or in this way, or does that matter at all?
I don't think so. I think they any like reputable bookshop does like a thing called BookScan, which is a kind of global database of book sales, and so and so that's how they track things like bestsellers and things, because it all goes into kind of one central location. So pre-orders are fantastic. Pre-orders are a huge indicator of success, and so by all means, please pre-order it. Please just buy it from anywhere. I'm not picky. If you need to buy it from Amazon, buy it from Amazon. I'd much prefer you buy it from an independent bookshop, but the only thing is it's a numbers game. I need to get those numbers up. I want people to buy it however they can. For me, so leave your ethics at the door, buy it from an arms dealer if you have to. I have to make a success of this.
Okay.
Thanks so much, guys. I've really enjoyed chatting.
Yeah, same. Thanks so much.
And we'll catch up with you soon.
All right, awesome.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
Keep us updated on the next books.
Will do. Thanks a lot, guys.
All right.
All right.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.